Good evening. My name is John Linzie, and this is my senior project lecture. Quote, "Then come the salon composers, that elegant, perfumed category which is received everywhere with eagerness. For the composers of this genre are nearly all performers and have no need of assistance to get their work appreciated. Should one of them appear at a salon, there is general rejoicing, everyone trying to outdo each other in welcoming him, celebrating him, begging him to present the delightful piece that he has just composed, for the last piece is always delightful." End quote. Undoubtedly, this descriptive passage conjures the classic image of a composer at the piano performing his work in an intimate salon setting. Many paintings have been created that present this image. Within them, one gets a sense of the atmosphere of the classical and romantic periods in Europe. One composer who had performed frequently in exactly this manner and setting numerous times was Reynaldo Hahn. Hahn's music has remained in the singer's general repertory and has seen a larger appreciation in recent decades. This is in part due to the simplicity and accessibility of his songs, which have allowed them to be performed and appreciated by a large variety of singers. These selections of mélodie or French art song are excellent representations of salon songs, a subgenre of French art song. Salon songs were usually written by composers to make money from the growing market of amateur, domestic middle-class musicians and the growing commission demand from wealthy salon hosts. This genre of songs was almost always performed in salons, where they found an appreciative audience. They are known for their overall simplicity and accessibility toward amateur performers. This evening, I will discuss the history and significance of salons in Paris as it pertains to salon songs, as well as the many changes in French society that affected music in those salons. Next, I will discuss the life and career as Reynaldo Hahn as a performer and composer, exploring his relationship and specialization of the salon song subgenre. Finally, I will analyze 3 songs composed by Hahn to further demonstrate his influence of the subgenre and its culmination through his compositions. The salon can be found as far back as the medieval period. At this time, they were built in monasteries and cathedrals and were meant as a setting to discuss the most recent services. From this, one may observe that salons are inherently social settings. By the 1600s, the earliest personal salons begin to appear. These salons were meant for leisure and were always found in wealthy homes. Another way to describe the salon and its function is as a room that is removed from the workings and routines of the rest of the house. The events in salons were known as soirees or matinees, depending on the time of day. Jennifer Llewellyn and Steve Thompson state that almost all salons were hosted by women, known as salonières, in their private homes. The salonières determined the guest list and, in most cases, the agenda and procedures in the salon. In addition to hosting the events, the salonières acted as speakers and often as performers. According to Llewellyn and Thompson, early salons were more social than intellectual, involving games and light conversation. However, by the 18th century, salons had become more intellectual and rigorous, serving as de facto universities. By this time, they had also become much more common. During the French Revolution of 1789, the wealthy people of France were persecuted and either left the country in exile or were executed by revolutionary forces. Salons disappeared during this time because of the hostile opinion of the people towards the aristocracy. After the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, the wealthy returned to France and began to rebuild their homes and lives. Many new salons were included in the new homes and mansions being built along the boulevards of Paris during the reconstruction by Georges Eugene Haussmann. This took place during the reign of Napoleon III between the years 1853 to 1870. These new salons, like their earlier counterparts, were leisure rooms in wealthy homes and varied in size in accordance to the wealth of the homeowner. By this time, the salon was a staple of high society. Its guest lists included writers, critics, poets, musicians and composers, artists, and fellow members of a similarly high class. The saloniers relished in such prestigious company. The use of salons and the programming of concerts and recitals increased as time went on. The growth in size and stability of the middle class in France created a new demographic for salon use with the creation of commercial or public salons. These public salons, not found in private homes, hosted concerts, lectures, and performances for the public. The lower middle working classes that could not afford a private or commercial salon found the same atmosphere in cafes. Another equivalent to the salon were the musical societies. Music societies served the same function as salons or cafes and were used to premiere the works of composers, as well as hosting performances and concerts of older works. The members of the music societies were usually from the newly formed bourgeoisie. Salons offered a private social setting for the upper classes and allowed them to become acquainted with the prominent artists and literary figures of the time. Many of these literary figures and artists usually lived as middle or lower class citizens. The salon granted an opportunity to mingle with the wealthy, especially as possible patrons or commissioners. In addition to this, it offered an amount of social prestige, fame, and exposure. At the same time, a growing interest in the arts occurred that would continue to grow until the outbreak of World War I. Lastly, salons provided a similar setting to the many opera houses across Paris. This was truer during the off-season for opera houses, where many audience members would search for a source of music to entertain them. The setting of the salon was much more intimate than a concert hall, and it was an especially good setting for smaller forms and styles of music, such as chamber music, solo instrumental music, and art songs. Salons continued to be a staple of French society throughout the late 1800s. The period known as La Belle Époque was a time where the arts flourished in Paris. The time span of this era was from 1871, after the death of Victor Hugo, to 1914, at the beginning of the First World War. However, during the end of the century, developments in technology would occur that would render the function of the salon and the music intended for it useless. This technology includes the self-playing piano and the growing industrial production of pianos for domestic use, developments in recording, the phonograph, and the radio that allowed listeners to hear music in their own homes. The role of the musicians and composer-performers in salons had been a changing role as time moved forward. Originally, musicians were included as entertainment and were usually drowned out by the many conversations that were taking place. The composers who had been commissioned for work in the salons garnered more attention, and their performances of their music was a relatively large focus during an event. The composers of the salon pieces were almost always performers, and often accompanied themselves or another soloist at the piano. This was especially true during the end of the 18th century and after, when salon events became more rigid, academic, and focused. Many musicians and composers relied heavily on salon work for the bulk or all of their financial support. After the reemergence of salons in the early 19th century, the arts and literature played a larger role in salon activities. The audiences would pay closer attention, and many saloniers would encourage proper audience behavior during performances. As the century progressed, many salons made the arts the dominant focus for their events, and some niche salons hosted events that were purely music-based, acting more as recitals or small concerts. Salon events almost always acted as stages for composers to premiere new works. The salons gave these composers a great deal in terms of exposure. New technology in printing allowed for sheet music to become more affordable and therefore more accessible to the growing middle class. Another factor that helped popularize salon songs was the piano and the wealth of amateur and professional piano music that was being written and published. The most important of these was the character piece. Character pieces were short works written for solo instruments, mostly for piano, and were commonly written among piano composers. Pianos were a necessity in salons, since a large majority of salon music utilized them. Its use is rooted in the salon song subgenre as the primary accompanying instrument and is therefore an important aspect. The origins of the salon song as a genre can be traced back to the French romance, or romance pure song, a solo art song for voice and piano composed in the classical tradition. It was composed during the 1700s until around the early 1840s. They were mostly composed for and performed in salons. The romance salon pieces were normally performed as encores during events, and they were never met with serious appraise. Romances were also considered by Evan Thibault to be a singer's rather than composer's art. They were performed frequently, and many composers dedicated much of their musical output to writing romances. Because it is in the classical tradition, there is always a clear form. The form of the romance was typically strophic, meaning the same music is set under a different verse of text. Key changes were never distant from the home key. The vocal line of the romance utilized a narrow range, stepwise motion, syllabic text declamation, and had little to no relation to the text. There were no melismas or extensive passage work that required great stamina or an excessively loud tone. The vocal line was broken into 2 or 4 bar phrases. The accompaniment was made up of arpeggiated or homophonic chords with sporadic melodic passages. Its purpose was to further emphasize the vocal line and therefore had no independence or use outside of harmonic support. The texts were simple poems of varying quality. The romance pure song in particular used poems that described love, mutual or unrequited, as well as other romantic themes. Because of the simplicity and briefness of the romance, they were published with increasing frequency. The writer J.A. Dallaire estimated that by the 1830s, over 500 new romances were being published each year. A notable composer of the romance was Johann Paul Martini, whose romance titled Plaisir d'amour is one of the only romances in the current general singer's repertory. Another was Pauline Duchambeau, who composed around 400 romances in the classical tradition. By the 1830s, the market for the romance had become flooded with underdeveloped works that had no staying power in the years that followed their initial release. In addition, many composers did not think they could fully or accurately express the new waves of poetry that were being written at the time. In the 1830s, France was introduced to the Lieder, or German solo art song, of Franz Schubert. Franz Schubert, from 1797 to 1828, was a Viennese composer with a large and prolific output of music. He composed in all mediums, but none as prolifically as his art songs. Schubert would go on to elevate the status of Lieder. Schubert often performed in the salons of his friends in Vienna, who also acted as his primary benefactors. The events, known as Schubertiades, were organized primarily for Schubert to premiere his music. This was unusual for the time, as there were very few salons that hosted events dedicated solely to music. Schubert died with the majority of his songs unpublished. After being published posthumously by his friends, they became very popular, and editions were soon being translated and published in France. Schubert's music was being championed by some major performers of the time, primarily Adolphe Nourrit and his pupil François Wörtel, who sang them using French translations. Up until recently, it was very common for works to be performed in the native language of the performers, as opposed to the original language in which it was composed. Schubert's music inspired many French composers of the time. In combination with the inspiration from Schubert was the desire to move away from the romance and the saturated market filled with underdeveloped songs. A new wave of composers began to work on art songs using romantic and progressive elements. They began experimenting with song forms and musical techniques in order to create a French art song that matched the maturity of the German Lied. The term mélodie is believed to have been coined by Hector Berlioz in a set of songs using Irish folk texts. After this publication, the term mélodie became the new title of the French solo song. The French mélodie was to follow in the tradition of Schubert's Lieder. However, it was not originally intended for the salons, as the romance had been. These new songs were more complex than the romance, new harmonies and tonalities being used. Forms, though initially mostly strophic, were experimented with and expanded upon. The vocal lines of the mélodie had a deeper connection with the poetry, and their composition utilized a deeper understanding of the text. New compositional techniques such as text painting, lyricism, and descriptive melodic writing were used in the composition of vocal lines. The accompaniments were much more involved and varied in complexity. The extent of variety in accompaniment writing spanned from simply composed homophonic or chordal accompaniments and arpeggiated figures to thickly textured orchestral accompaniments and virtuosic piano writing. The texts being set were representative of the new artistic and literary movements taking place in France at the time, such as the Symbolist and Parnassian movements. Major composers began developing styles that were unique to them or could be identified as theirs. Despite the progressiveness in the development of the mélodie, many aspects of the romance remained, including the concentration of form and clarity of diction that resulted from the syllabic text declamation. Many composers still wrote music with the conservative classical ideals in mind while maintaining the developed elements of the mélodie. These pieces were well suited for the salons. Out of this conservative school of thought, the subgenre of salon songs was born. Salon songs are pieces composed for salon events or for domestic use and were arranged for voice, mostly solo, though sometimes two voices, and piano. They followed in the classical tradition of the romance and were indistinguishable from them during the 18th century until the 1830s. They were perfect for the salon setting as a song that solely utilized voice and piano, an instrument found in all salons. The miniature style would have been inappropriate on a larger stage, as in a concert hall, particularly because early salon songs were composed and performed more for entertainment than serious artistry. Like the romance, the salon songs of the 18th century were simply composed pieces that focused on the vocal line. The vocal line was set syllabically to the text, meaning one note value was set to one syllable of a word. The accompaniment was simple harmonic support, using blocked chords or arpeggiated figures. Key changes were also always closely related to the home key. Neither the vocal line or accompaniment were written with any connection to the text. The poetic texts varied in quality and tended to revolve around themes of love and romance. They were more like showpieces that displayed an amateur's voice for the guests in a salon. These songs were popular in salons as encore pieces to an event. The newer composers began to adopt the developments and techniques that were being experimented with and utilized at that time and moving forward. It is at this stage in development that the salon song as a subgenre can be distinguished from the mélodie through its conservative and classicist style. The accompaniments were still written as harmonic support to emphasize the voice. The vocal line remained conservative, with no melismatic or overly lyrical passages. However, there was a deeper connection to the poetic texts that were being set by the composers when writing the vocal line and accompaniment. New forms were being utilized, such as the through composed and modified strophic forms. The harmonic vocabulary of these composers was more akin to the Romantic period. The texts being set were written mostly by the contemporaries of the composers, many of whom were the leading literary figures in France. Sometimes, composers would perform their pieces for the poet in a salon. The demise of the salon came during the First World War. The war tore Europe apart and changed it beyond recognition, physically and culturally. During the first part of the war, salons were still used, and some salons were created for officers serving behind the trenches. As time moved forward, the technological advancements that would replace the function of the salon, such as the radio, became more affordable and were bought by people of lower classes, and even sent to the trenches during the war. By the end of the war, the salon had become outdated and disappeared forever. One major composer who helped to develop the romance into the mélodie and brought salon songs to a higher status in salons was Charles Gounod from 1818 to 1893. Gounod partially dominated classical music in France. and was a major figure in the transition from romance to mélodie. Quote, "With Gounod arrives a repertoire of romantic French song that celebrated singers began to include in their programs alongside the leader of Schubert and Schumann. No longer the encore piece or the lightweight song for the salon as the romance had been, the mélodies of Gounod gave newfound status to French solo song." End quote. Another composer was Jules Massenet, who expanded upon the ideas of Gounod and is considered by some to be Gounod's successor in the development of the mélodie. Massenet composed 250 mélodies. He incorporated the salon aesthetic in many of his art songs and is considered a master of the salon style. Reynaldo Hahn, one of Massenet's pupils, composed 95 art songs for solo voice. Hahn continued the tradition of salon songs and in fact specialized in composing them. Reynaldo Hahn was born in Caracas, Venezuela on August 9 in 1874. He was born as the last of 12 children to Don Carlos Hahn, a German Jew, and Elena Maria Echenigaray, the daughter of a wealthy aristocrat in Venezuela. Hahn's family moved to Paris before his 4th birthday. It is during this time that his family began to recognize his aptitude towards music. His first instrument was the piano. Hahn states that he was, quote, "quite sure that when he was 3 years old and barely as tall as the keyboard of the piano, he already knew how to place his fingers on the keys." End quote. Hahn was recognized as a child prodigy and began his first lessons in composition with Charles Gounod for a brief time. At the age of 11, Hahn was accepted into the Conservatoire National Supérieur de Musique in Paris. It is here where he studied composition with Jules Massenet. Richard Bed, an expert on the voices of actors and singers, states that he was believed to be the youngest pupil ever to have pursued the study of solfege, harmony, and composition at the same time. During his time at the Conservatoire, Hahn wrote a number of songs, some of which have remained his most popular pieces, including Si mes vers avaient des ailes and L'heure exquise. After leaving the Conservatoire, Hahn continued his studies in composition with Camille Saint-Saëns for a time. Hahn performed for almost his entire life. He made his musical debut at the age of 6, performing for Princess Mathilde, the niece of Napoleon Bonaparte, in her salon. Other notable early performances include Queen Victoria, King Edward VII, and King Alphonse of Spain. Hahn began performing regularly in the salon of Alphonse Daudet at the age of 16. It is during one of these performances that Hahn sang through his cycle Chansons Grises for the poet of the text, Paul Verlaine. Hahn would continue working in salons during the Belle Époque era. It is also the period in which Hahn composed most of his songs. The salon was the setting where he felt the most comfortable. His charming and witty personality made him a popular guest and entertainer during salon events. The venues offered a perfect setting for Salon to premiere his pieces. Even his voice was well suited for the salon. He is said to have had a small baritone voice that was pleasing to the ear. He is also cited as having precise articulation and diction, and had a gift for musical interpretation. He would oftentimes sing and accompany himself at the piano, usually with a cigarette in his mouth, according to Willy Scheu. Hahn began composing and publishing in other mediums, such as opera and solo piano. In the 1890s, Hahn became intensely interested in the works of Mozart and conducted 2 performances of Don Giovanni in 1896, one in Paris and the other at the Salzburg Festival in Austria. Hahn would also begin a career as a music critic for major publications, such as La Presse in 1899, La Flèche in 1904, Le Journal Université des Annales from 1909 to 1914, and Le Figaro from 1943 to 1945. Hahn became a French citizen in 1909 and volunteered to join the French military during World War I. During his time in the military, Hahn continued composing songs and sketched out ideas for future works. After the end of the war, Hahn returned to Paris, where he found that the salons and the salon tradition had disappeared. He did not stop composing or performing. From 1919 to 1947, Hahn composed and premiered a prolific number of works, including a large number of operettas, the most well-known of which was his comical operetta titled Mozart, and operas such as Les Marchands de Venise, based on the play The Merchant of Venice by William Shakespeare, as well as some chamber music. Hahn also composed a symphonic work titled Concerto Provençal in 1945, three complete concertos and another unfinished concerto. He published his second book of 20 Mélodies in 1921, a book of 9 Mélodies, and another book of songs that set Spanish and Portuguese text to music, called Chansons Españoles. In addition to composing, he continued to work as a conductor in major performances. Lastly, Hahn made numerous recordings of his music and the music of others that can be found and heard today. Reynaldo Hahn died on January 28, 1947. Hahn primarily composed his songs in the salon style. His pieces are charming, elegant, and simple. There is always a calming quality that dominates the mood of his pieces. His vocal lines are the primary element in his songs. They use a modest, sometimes narrow range. He had good text declamation, meaning he was good at setting text to music. Hahn composed beautiful speech-like melodies that tended to imitate the natural flow of the French language. He also made extensive use of text painting in his voice parts. The piano accompaniments act as harmonic support to emphasize the vocal line and poetry. They are, however, involved and active in expressing the text. They tend to have transparent textures and are generally simply written, meaning that they are not complex. Richard Bebb states that one of the most immediately noticeable features of Hahn's songwriting is the absolute simplicity of the piano accompaniments. They are never used as anything more than a support to the vocal line. It is the enhancement of the poem, not musical elaboration, that Hahn is after. In this, he ignored the examples of his masters and contemporaries and harked directly back to the classical style of Lully and Rameau. Hahn tended to use strophic, modified strophic, and ternary forms in his songs. He was a truly French composer and possibly the last to carry on the salon song tradition before the salons themselves disappeared. Now, we will analyze 3 of Hahn's French art songs that are good representations of the salon style, as well as Hahn's style as it relates to the salon songs. The 3 songs I will analyze are L'heure exquise, Offrande, and Applaudisse. The first piece I will analyze is titled L'heure exquise, meaning exquisite hour. L'heure exquise is the 5th song in Hahn's first song cycle titled Chanson grise. It is the most famous song of the set and is programmed often for performances. Chanson grise was composed by Hahn around 1890 as an assignment when he was studying under Jules Massenet at the Conservatoire. The text, which was published without a title in a collection of poems called La Bonne Chanson, is by Paul Verlaine. Paul Verlaine, from 1844 to 1896, was a poet associated with the Symbolists, a reactionary movement against naturalism that sought to present absolute truths through symbolic imagery and language, and the decadent poets, who focused on themes of excess and the artificial. Verlaine's texts lend themselves well to music and were chosen frequently by composers. This poem alone has over 100 settings by different French composers. Verlaine was also an active guest in many Parisian salons. The calm quality must have been attractive to Hahn, who searched for poems that fit into his style. Paul Verlaine was a contemporary of Hahn, and there is a record of Hahn performing this cycle for Verlaine at a salon. L'heure exquise is one of many excellent examples of the salon song style in which Hahn typically composed. It is reminiscent of a type of romance called a nocturne, in which 2 equal voices are composed under different verses of text. Nocturnes were also performed in the salons during the time of the Romance in the late 18th century. Nocturne may also mean night piece. This is important, as it clearly inspired Hahn's choice of structure from the traditional nocturnal song form, a classicist element. It must have also inspired his choice of sound from the night piece definition. The latter is a common theme among Romantic-era composers. These night piece nocturnes were performed often in salons, typically on solo piano. The form of L'heure exquise is strophic, with some modifications between verses in order to better serve the poetry, such as the use of duple meters, which we will discuss later. Each section is clearly defined and covers 4 lines of the poetic text. The overall structure of the phrases and of the piece is a prime example of the classicist traditions that originate in the Romance. It remains accessible and clear formally. At the beginning of each section, a piano prelude or interlude is played, signifying the coming entrance of the singer. This can be seen at the top left for the first verse, the top right for the second verse, and at the bottom for the third verse. There are variations in the timing of the interlude in the second and third verses. The vocal line, for the most part, utilizes a very narrow range from D flat to A flat, except in 2 sections shown on the right. This is reminiscent of the salon song vocal parts, as conservative and meant for amateur voices. This part of the melody revolves heavily around the minor third between F and A flat. This narrow range assists greatly in creating and maintaining the calm mood and atmosphere. The listener is able to hear and follow the line without any fear of extreme emotional or musical shifts. At the end of each section, the final line of verse of poetry is sung separately. The range for this section extends from a G natural to an F. This section in the first verse, seen at the top left, is marked délicatement or delicately. This is additionally marked piano. The variant of this section in the second verse at the top right is also marked piano, and in the third verse at the bottom, the closing section is marked pianissimo. These dynamics on the climactic pitches are an example of the French musical device known as elated restraint. The device is common to French vocal music. The idea is to show excitement through restraint, vocally and emotionally, as opposed to the use of excessive emotion that one may find in more Italianate singing. The climactic sections of each verse show this restraint well, despite the large leap. The movement of the melody does not give up the mood that the previous sections have set up, and instead maintain it. The reserved quality of this musical device fits well into the conservative salon aesthetic. The phrases of the song span just over 2 bars, shown at the top left, to 4 bars, shown at the top and middle on the right. The short phrases are a part of the salon style in this song. The triplet meter of the piece allows Han to craft his vocal line so that it closely represents the rhythm of the French language. Occasionally, Han uses duple meter to assist in the text declamation, shown on the left, middle, and right at the bottom row. We observe the romantic developments from the mélodie here, where Han has crafted the melody in order to better represent the text. There are no melismas or excessively lyrical passages. This is an important quality of the salon song. L'heure exquise is an especially good song for young singers. The vocal line is conservative. The high notes are in a reasonable part of the range and do not demand large amounts of sound or stamina. And the rhythms are simple and always match up with the accompaniment underneath. However, the ability to float the high notes is the most challenging part of the piece and will force young singers to practice singing softly in that part of the passaggio. The accompaniment consists of a repeating arpeggiated nocturnal figure shown on the right that is written for harmonic support. The texture of the accompaniment is thin, usually consisting of the melodic figure and a few held notes or chords. One can hear how the consistent repeating of or returning to the motif creates a sense of familiarity and unity and assists the vocal line in establishing the calming mood of the piece. The simplicity of the accompaniment helps to distinguish this piece as a salon song. The activeness of the accompaniment as it assists the vocal line in expressing the text is a more developed element. There are variations in the figure at various points in the piece that are shown on the top left, on the top right, and at the bottom. Near the closing section, the accompaniment is written as variations of the same arpeggiated figure. From this analysis, one may observe how Han has captured the style of salon songs in the classically styled devices, such as the form and structure of the piece. This includes the role and stylistic choices of the vocal line and accompaniment. In addition, one sees the influence of the developments of the mélodie in the involvement of both the vocal line and accompaniment in expressing the poetry. Another developed element is the choice of poetry from one of his contemporaries. Now, we will listen to a recording of L'heure exquise. All recordings are performed by myself and accompanied by Dr. Gregory Gallagher.
La lune blanche luit dans les bois, de chaque branche part une voix sous la ramée. Oh bien-aimé, les temps reflètent, profond miroir, la silhouette du sol noir, où les vents pleurent, rêvant. C'est l'heure. Un vaste et tendre apaisément semble descendre du firmament que l'astre irise. C'est l'heure exquise.
The second song to be analyzed is titled Offrande, meaning offering. Offrande was first composed by Hahn in the spring of 1981 and was published a few years later in a collection of 20 songs titled 20 Mélodies. This is another excellent example of the salon style of Hahn, though slightly more progressive harmonically than the previously analyzed L'heure exquise. The form of Offrande is strophic, with modifications between each of the 3 verses of text. The phrases of each section are written between 2 to 4 bars, and some, such as in measures 19 to 20, pictured on the right, are only 1 measure in length. Here, Hahn remains in the tradition of salon songs in his choice of phrase length. Each section can be broken into 2 parts. The first part, which sits low in the vocal range of the singer, can be seen in the first verse shown at the top left, in the second verse shown at the top right, and in the third verse shown at the bottom. The vocal line in this first part of each section is closer to a recitative in style, with speech patterns being emphasized heavily and no lyricism until the last note that transitions into the higher section. This low phrase also utilizes a narrow range, from G to C in each of the 3 sections. The vocal line relies heavily on the G, which acts as a fifth to the secondary dominant chords in the accompaniment. The second section sits higher in the voice and can be seen in the first verse shown on the top left, the second verse shown at the bottom, and the third verse shown at the right. The higher section of each verse is a descending passage that works its way back down to the lower range of the first part. Some dotted quarter notes allow for lyricism, but even this section closely resembles recitative in its emphasized speech patterns. In the higher part, we see the combination of elements that would make up the vocal line of a romantically developed salon song. Though it does sit higher, the mood is no more dramatic than it was before. This maintains the element of accessibility that is so prevalent in salon songs. There is some slight harmonic variation in the high part within the second verse. Rather than resolving to a one chord like the first and third verses, Hahn continues to build tension by resolving to the secondary dominant chord of the submediant in the home key. The section is higher in the range. It is soft and still written with a conservative feel. This is similar to the examples of related restraint from the analysis from the Exquise. The rhythms of the melody accentuate the rhythm of the text. Hahn utilizes syncopation to help disguise the larger beats of the piece being played by the piano. This gives the vocal line a natural sound. The syncopations are highlighted in blue. In addition, Hahn utilizes triplet rhythms in order to help imitate the natural rhythms of the French spoken language, as well as distinguish the rhythm of the 4/4 time signature. The triplets are highlighted in red. The compositional motivation to mimic the French language is a progressive element of the vocal line in this salon piece, and helps to showcase the combination of classical and developed methods that are combined in the salon song subgenre. The structure of the vocal line lends itself well to amateur or young singers. Its simplicity and limited range do not demand much from a singer. Because of this, it also makes for a good introduction to some of the more challenging elements, such as the syncopations and triplet rhythms, as well as the recitative-like vocal style. The text of this piece was also written by Paul Verlaine. In it, we see more of Verlaine's use of symbolic imagery and romantic themes. The accompaniment, like the vocal line, can be broken into two parts for each section. The first part, played under the lower half of each section of the vocal line, is strictly homophonic, or chordal. Hahn wrote in the accidentals rather than using key signatures with them. The leitmotif is found complete in the first measure highlighted in red. Harmonically, it starts on a dominant or 5 chord, and instead of resolving to a 1 chord, it changes to a secondary dominant that serves no function except to lead back into the dominant chord in the repeat of the motif. This is a very important element in analyzing the progressive aspects of Offrande as a salon song. Its sound is odd, standing out in defiance of the listener's expectation for a resolution. Its dissonant nature in relation to the key and harmonic progression is a romantic element. In Offrande, we observe the progressiveness of music that Hahn was inspired by, and how he was able to utilize it within the salon song style that he embraced so naturally. Now we will listen to a recording of Offrande.
Voici des fruits, des fleurs, des feuilles et des branches, et puis voici mon cœur qui n'est pas que pour vous. Ne le déchirez pas avec votre main blanche, et que vos yeux si beaux l'homme le présent soit doux. J'arrive tout couvert encore des rosées que les vents du matin viennent glacer à mon front. Souffrez comme fatigue à vos pieds reposés. Rêvez des chers instants qui la délaceront. Sur votre jeune sein, laissez rouler ma tête, toute son or encore de vos derniers baisers. Laissez-la s'apaiser.
The final song to be analyzed is titled A Cloris. The piece is another example of the classicist salon style. Hahn has taken the neoclassicism a step further, creating a piece that sounds more Baroque. A Cloris was composed by Hahn between the years 1895 to 1916. Unlike the other pieces, A Cloris is through composed, meaning there is a different music for each section of text. This is a more progressive form for French art song and is a progressive element to this salon song. Each of these sections in the poetry differ from one another and are distinct. Hahn reflects this by making each section contrast musically from one another. The vocal line has a good mixture of lyricism and declamatory phrases. The first section of music, measures 1 through 9, have many short phrases that mimic the rhythms of the French language, as well as the character of the singer. The breaks are highlighted in red. The range of this section spans an octave. The melody usually sits within a fifth until measure 6. It is important to note that the text at this point, the speaker begins to loosen the restraint in his excitement. The many breaks in the vocal line of the A section imply that the singer is excited and nervous. Another example of elated restraint, similar to what we saw in both Offrande and L'heure exquise. This is combined with a tender, romantic quality that is a large part of Hahn's aesthetic. Even though the phrases have breaks, their overall length spans a measure to just over a measure. Each phrase in this section has an arching quality, moving up and down before the phrase ends. This is an element that seems as if it was meant to accentuate the singer. This choice is not unusual for salon songs. We had discussed that the romance was originally meant to showcase the voice. The difference in this piece is the melody's relation to the text. The second section is more lyrical. The phrases are longer and more legato. This contrasts with the first section. Hahn has done this purposely to express the changing way in which the speaker in the poem expresses himself to his love. Each verse he becomes less restrained in the way he expresses his joy and love towards Cloris. Also in this section, we see a way in which the vocal line and accompaniment interact with each other through counterpoint. Counterpoint is the strict method of arranging two melodic lines at the same time, and was a staple of the Baroque period. Excessive use led to its abandonment during the classical period that followed. This undoubtedly assisted in the Baroque sound of this song. The third, or C section, is another contrasting one in relation to the first two. Like the second section, the phrases are longer and more lyrical. However, the range of this section is extended higher. This also expresses the growing excitement of the speaker in the text up until the climax in measure 18, highlighted in red. After that, the vocal line begins to descend until it finally resolves to a one chord. Another element of this section that is unique is the use of ornaments in the vocal line, highlighted in blue. According to Britannica, an ornament in music refers to the embellishment of a melody, either by adding notes or by modifying rhythms. Ornamentation was common in music of both the Baroque and classical periods. One must begin to ask why the analysis of Baroque-styled elements in the vocal line is important. To answer this, I will discuss the poet. The text for A Cloris was written by Théophile de Vieux. Vieux was a French Baroque poet and dramatist from 1590 to 1626. He was a controversial poet in his day and had established his reputation as a leader of the freethinker group in Paris. He died in poor health after being banished from France. His poetry was rediscovered by Romantic figures of the 19th century, where his work found new appreciation. The connection between the Baroque elements of the vocal line and how it relates to the text is clear. The accompaniment is equally expressive in this regard. In the opening two measures, we are introduced to more Baroque elements. In the right hand, an ornament is played and repeated. This ornament is highlighted in red. It will return later in the piece at various points, in measures 3 to 4, 7 to 8, 11 through 13, 16 to 17, 20, and lastly in measure 22, where it leads to the final resolve. The recurrence of this ornament makes it a unifying element of the piece. In the left hand, a ground bass or ostinato theme is played, highlighted in blue. The ground bass is a repeating melodic pattern in the bass part of a musical piece, and was commonly used during the Baroque period. This pattern is repeated twice in the opening. Variations on the pattern occur throughout the piece, as in measures 4 to 5, 8 to 9, 11 through 14, and 18 to 19. The original pattern returns for the final 3 measures. The recurrence of the bass pattern makes it another unifying element of the piece. This is an example of how Hahn utilizes the accompaniment actively to support and emphasize the poetry. Of the 3 pieces, this best represents the aesthetic of the salon song. It is a synthesis of classical and romantic musical ideals and elements that are combined with masterful elegance in a miniature work. The neo-Baroque style of the piece fits into the progressive developments of the mélodie, particularly the attention and depth of understanding of the text that influenced Hahn's compositional choices. Now we will hear the last recording.
S'il est vrai, Clarisse, que tu m'aimes, mais j'entends que tu m'aimes bien. Je ne crois pas que le roi m'aime et du bonheur pareil au mien. Que la mort serait importune à venir changer ma fortune pour la félicité des cieux. Tout ce qu'on dit de l'ambroisie ne touche point ma fantaisie au prix des grâces de tes yeux. Tout ce qu'on dit de l'ambroisie ne touche point ma fantaisie au prix des grâces de tes yeux.
Tonight's lecture has discussed the topic of salon songs, exploring the history of the Parisian salon and following the development of the salon song within the larger genre of French art song. We also discussed how one may distinguish the salon song subgenre as it developed alongside the mélodie. The salon song at one time was met with a patronizing attitude, as well as the people who composed them. And although we have discussed some justification for that attitude, we have also shown some elegant examples of the refinement and mastery of the subgenre through the compositions of Reynaldo Hahn. I hope these examples have shown the potential in performing Hahn's music, especially for younger singers. I also hope that this lecture has shown an often unthought of aspect in the study of the general singer's repertory, as well as a cultural lineage that connects many song composers. Thank you, and good evening.